before I knew anything about wine, and shortly after my first wine epiphany, I woke up and thought to myself, what's all this talk about Chardonnay? Everyone talks about it and they keep saying things like fruity, buttery, and oaked. What does all that mean? At the time, I was still living in London, so after I went to work, I went to a store called Oddbins and asked the man behind the counter for a fruity, buttery, and oaked Chardonnay. Now here I felt all important because I knew 3 things to ask for in a Chardonnay: fruity, oaked, and buttery, although I had absolutely no idea what it would taste like. I also asked him, how can you tell if it's got oak in it? He said that it would taste oaky. All right, well, that didn't help me very much, but he did direct me to a Wolf Blass Chardonnay, a South Australian Chardonnay. So I ran home excited to try it. And you know something? It tasted even better than I expected. For the first time, I felt like I was on the inner circle. I knew what fruity, buttery, and oaked meant. So Australian Chardonnay has a little special place in my heart. Now, knowing what I know, I really have to tip my cap to the Australians. As I said at the end of the last lecture, Australia does it all. White, red, sparkling, sweet, fortified, wines that age, wines at every price point, every noble variety, and then some. If you haven't found an Australian wine you like, you'll have a great list of new wines to try after this lecture. For today's lecture, you're going to need the following wines: a Riesling, preferably from Eden or Clare Valley, a Semillon, either from the Hunter or Barossa, or you may even have a Semillon Chardonnay blend, an oaked Chardonnay from anywhere in Australia, a Shiraz, preferably from Barossa or McLaren Vale from South Australia, a Rhone Valley Syrah from France, and a Cabernet Sauvignon from Coonawara. The rule in tasting is that you taste dry before sweet, white before red, and light-bodied to full-bodied. Tasting order is particularly important in professional tasting. Why? Because sometimes when you taste a full-bodied wine, the medium-bodied wine tastes dilute in comparison. Your palate is affected. Have you ever tasted orange juice before and after brushing your teeth? It's the same kind of thing. We don't have any sweet wines here. They're all dry. But we're going to taste a tiny bit out of order today because different regions have different specialties. We've done this before, so feel free to hit the pause button, take a sip of water, eat a plain cracker, just to recalibrate your palate, and then come back. The first vineyard in Australia was planted in 1788 with vines from the Cape of Good Hope. Yes, South Africa. They were picked up by its first European governor and planted in New South Wales in the garden of the government house just north of Sydney. New South Wales from 1788 to 1823 was officially a British penal colony, comprised mainly of convicts, sailors, and their wives. Given this, it's not surprising that support for winemaking was slow in coming. For example, the first vineyards were showing some promise, so the governor asked for some technical assistance from England to establish some groundwork to develop the vineyards. As the story goes, England sent 2 French prisoners of war to provide technical expertise. I guess they assumed all French people know how to make wine, but it backfired terribly. One prisoner was so ignorant, he was sent back to England immediately. The other one made cider instead of wine and then used peaches instead of apples. So it took a little while to develop Australia's now flourishing wine industry. We've come a long way since then. Realizing their own untapped potential, Australia's wineries banded together in the 1970s to create a 25-year plan to become one of the world's top wine-producing and wine-exporting nations. But they did it in 15. Since the 1970s, they increased their production over tenfold. And in 2005, they were the 6th largest wine-producing nation in the world. And today, the #1 wine brand in the United States is an Australian wine called Yellowtail. This is particularly amazing considering that Australia, although it's about the same size as the United States, is 40% desert. The outback takes up 70% of its landmass, and the country has only 7% of the population of the United States. You may remember we talked about the flying winemakers a while back. The term began when a team of Australian winemakers was commissioned to consult for some French co-ops. They lent their expertise and innovative spirit to more traditional French wineries to create more modern style wines with an international appeal. One reason the Australian winemakers were able to do this was because their harvest is at the opposite time of the year of the French, so they were available. It also seems to be part of their makeup, the Australian culture to share and to help people learn. I know that because when I began studying wine, whenever I read Australian wine magazines or spoke to an Australian winemaker, it was always a breath of fresh air. They're really forthcoming in sharing information about their wines. So let's start with the region of New South Wales, where Sydney is. New South Wales is by far the most populated state. For example, there are more people in Sydney than the entire state of South Australia. But it's not the largest producer of wine. About 80 miles, or 128 kilometers, north of Sydney is the Hunter Valley, which is a great wine excursion for people visiting Sydney. The region is separated into the subregions of the Lower Hunter Valley and the Upper Hunter Valley. The Lower Hunter Valley is one of the warmest, most humid, and wettest climates in Australia. It gets about 800 to 950 millimeters of rainfall annually. The Upper Hunter Valley is a touch drier and even a little warmer. This region also has quite a bit of cloud cover. So what varieties do well here? Well, believe it or not, Semillon does. We spoke about Semillon in lecture 9 and 10. It's from Bordeaux, where it makes some incredibly long-lived, dry oaked wines and some lusciously, deliciously sweet wines. Hunter Semillon is a dry, unoaked, New World classic that can absolutely last decades. And the best vintages are generally the wetter ones. It's been described as having the structure and acidity of Riesling, so get out your Riesling. But I also want you to take out your oaked Chardonnay as well. I really want you to see the differences in the flavors and the structure of these wines. And to fully appreciate it, we'll have to compare and contrast these. So here I'm comparing the color of the Semillon and the Riesling. They're fairly similar in color. Now picking up the Chardonnay, the oaked Chardonnay is a bit deeper in color. But if it wasn't oaked, it probably would be somewhere in between. Now let's smell the Semillon. It's not very aromatic. Definitely not as aromatic as the Riesling, but a little bit more aromatic than the Chardonnay. Now the types of aromas I get with unoaked Semillon is a little bit of a citrus and lemon character, which is similar to what you see in Riesling, but you get a beeswax kind of character. So why don't you taste through all three? You're probably going to find that the Chardonnay is much bigger in body. And the acidity of the Semillon is higher than the Chardonnay, but the Riesling's even higher than the Semillon. In the Hunter Valley, the acidity for Semillon is much higher than other parts of Australia, say like Barossa. And it can be quite austere here and can be quite tight. Remember, what we mean by tight and austere is that you have a high level of acidity, light body, and it's a bit angular. It's not releasing a lot of its aromas. For Hunter Valley Semillon, they usually wait a few years to kind of loosen it up a little bit so that some of those aromas can come out and be more enjoyable. This is one of the rare New World whites that's not only known for aging for a long time, it's expected to. As it gets older, it takes on flavors of honey and toast, and that lime citrus character kind of fades. Outside the Hunter, you see Semillon oaked in other parts of Australia, and it has a richer body and tastes less of beeswax and more like a vanilla, lemony custard, obviously without the sweetness, as they are dry wines. You'll also see wines that have Semillon as part of a blend, such as Semillon Sauvignon Blanc or Semillon Chardonnay. Now, on Australian labels, if you see more than one variety listed, the one mentioned first is the predominant variety with the highest percentage of that variety in the blend. Here it says Semillon Chardonnay, so that means it has more Semillon than Chardonnay. But here it says Chardonnay Semillon, which means it has more Chardonnay than Semillon. Another white grape you see in New South Wales is called Verdelho. You heard me mention the name briefly in connection with Madeira, and it seems to be the same grape variety as Godello in Spain. It's medium-bodied, with stone fruit character and some light floral tones, and some people say that they get flavors of lime cordial. The big red grape variety in the Hunter Valley is Shiraz, but I'll talk more about that in a little while when we compare it to Barossa in South Australia. Now, Hunter Valley is one of Australia's GIs, or geographic indications. So you'll see the name on the label. This is similar to the Appellation Contrôlée, or AC, you see in Europe, although Australia has its own classification system. Speaking of terms, you see on the label sometimes Southeastern Australia. This means it's a multi-regional blend. You see this on more modestly priced wines in general. It means that the grapes could come from anywhere in Australia, meaning from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, or South Australia. If this were the United States, it would be like saying it could come from anywhere between Virginia and Texas. Often, though, the grapes come from the region of Riverina in New South Wales or Riverland in South Australia. And just as in California and pretty much everywhere outside of Europe, the word reserve has no legal definition. As a side note, remember in the beginning of this lecture when I said I felt all important because I knew 3 things about Chardonnay: fruity, buttery, and oaked? Gallo did a study several years ago on how many adjectives it takes to sell a wine. Can you guess the answer? It's 3. So if you're ordering wine at a restaurant and you want to convince your friends that it's the right choice, just give them 3 adjectives. You'll love this because it's fruity, concentrated, and rich. Or it tastes like apples, butter, and vanilla. But remember, it's just 3. But be sure to pick out 3 good ones. Probably not like cat's pee, barnyard, or diesel. Now let's go to the state of Victoria. There are quite a few wine zones here. We tasted a wine from the state in Lecture 8. Remember the Australian sticky? These sweet fortified wines are best known in the Victoria regions of Rutherglen and Glenrowan. These wines last for up to 3 months in your refrigerator, so if you have some still from Lecture 8, go ahead and taste it at the end of this lecture as a little sweet ending for a job well done. Farther south from Rutherglen or Glenrowan is a cool climate zone, still in the state of Victoria, around the natural bay of Port Phillip, near Melbourne, the 2nd largest city in Australia. Again, a winery tour throughout the region of Victoria would make a wonderful day excursion away from the big city. This region is farther away from the equator and closer to the South Pole, so it's cooler given its latitude. However, Port Phillip also provides a maritime influence. This is where we see cool climate varieties such as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and it's no surprise that you also see some sparkling wines here. Moet and Chandon have set up shop here, and remember, they also have a presence in Argentina now as well. Yarra Valley and the Mornington Peninsula are the best-known Australian regions for cool climate Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. The average daily temperature during harvest is about 67 degrees Fahrenheit, or 19.4 degrees Celsius. So that's quite cool. This allows the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir to show incredible acidity and finesse. Now, if you tasted a Yarra Valley or Mornington Peninsula Chardonnay versus, let's say, a Hunter or Adelaide, you would taste a more delicate body, a higher level of acidity, and more modest alcohol. It's a cooler region, so if you prefer cool climate Chardonnays, look for these regions on the bottle. Farther south still, and a short flight from Melbourne, is the Australian island and state of Tasmania. It's much closer to Antarctica than the equator, and the wine regions in northern Tasmania start at about 41 degrees south latitude. This puts Tasmania in the pathway of the so-called roaring 40s winds that hurl through the 40 to 50 degrees south latitude. They're called the roaring 40s because there are no land masses to slow them down besides Tasmania itself. In the northern hemisphere, this latitude would land at about a Porto in Portugal. But here, in comparison, it's quite cool. The average harvest temperature here is 63 degrees Fahrenheit, or 17.2 degrees Celsius. And it gets cooler as you move to southern Tasmania. The two main regions here are easy to remember. You have northern Tasmania and southern Tasmania. Tasmania has huge potential for quality cool climate varieties such as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, as well as aromatic varieties such as Riesling and Pinot Gris. Now, in the last decade, Tasmania has caught the eye of many investors. Both Moet and Chandon and Louis Roederer champagne houses use some Tasmanian-grown grapes for their Australian sparkling blends. And with increasing vine age and better quality clones being brought, the quality should continue to rise. Tasmania is known somewhat for its Riesling, and some producers make them in a more German style with some residual sugar and lower in alcohol. Now, the Pinot Noirs for Tasmania are even more delicate, but also quite fragrant, fresh, and crisp. Unfortunately, you don't see too many Australian Pinot Noirs in stores or restaurants because there's a preconceived notion that Australia is too hot for Pinot Noir. But I guarantee you, it's not too hot in Yarra, Mornington Peninsula, and especially not Tasmania. Going back to the mainland, let's revisit the Riesling we tasted before. Hopefully the one you have came from either Eden Valley or Clare Valley, as those are the two best-known regions for Riesling. Both Eden Valley and Clare Valley are located within the state of South Australia, with Eden being closer to Adelaide, the capital. These regions have a hilly topography, and the altitude here makes a difference. It's not as high as Salta in Argentina like we discussed in last lecture, but it's relatively high for Australia. And its nights can range from cool to quite cold. All of these factors help the Riesling stay quite crisp and delicate and make the best Riesling coming out of Australia. So let's taste it all on its own. Again, we saw as before, it's a pale color. And we already had seen that it's quite aromatic. We get some lime notes, some citrus notes, quite floral. And if you compare it to, let's say, the Semillon, like we were doing before, you can get a little hint of petrol. And if you hadn't smelled it before, go back and forth and see if you can get it now, because Australian Rieslings are known for getting that petrol aroma a little bit earlier than some other regions around the world. Let's taste it. This is quite dry. It's very, very dry, and it's a little austere. It reminds me of, let's say, Austrian Riesling, with a little more fruit and less minerality. The acid is quite high. And its alcohol is not as warm as, let's say, in Austria, but it is a bit warmer than, let's say, in Germany. If you tasted this side by side with an Alsatian Riesling, the Australian would be more upfront in its fruit, but it would be more focused in its character and less round in its mouthfeel. What you may want to do is to compare your tasting notes from this lecture to those of 11 and 15. This can tell you a lot about how you perceive the wine and can help you make buying decisions later on. I generally find the wines from Clare Valley a bit rounder and weightier than the ones from her sister Eden Valley, which have a stronger limey note, but both are quite delicious. You may also see some Sauvignon Blanc from this region and the Adelaide Hills, which includes Clare, but runs a bit farther south. Now it's time to come to the flagship red of Australia, Shiraz. We talked in previous lectures about the Syrah style from the Rhone Valley and the Shiraz style from Australia. Let's show you firsthand what this means. Let's take a look at the color. Well, here, the Shiraz is deeper in color than our Rhone Valley Syrah. It probably has something to do with the amount of new oak that's in the Australian Shiraz. Smelling both of them. Now, in its aromas, both have the Syrah character to it. So you got those raspberry tones and some black pepper. However, the Rhone style, or the Rhone Valley Syrah, is much more reserved in its fruit. The Australian one is much more powerful, much more in your face. It's more upfront, which again comes to the New World versus Old World. And the Australian doesn't really have minerality to it. The Rhone Valley Syrah actually has more aromatics of olive and herbal character and some savory notes, while on the nose you smell much more of sweet vanilla and some coconut notes to the Australian Shiraz. Now let's taste it. I'm going to taste the Rhone first. First off, the body of the Australian Shiraz is much bigger. And it has more dense tannins than this particular Gros Hermitage. And this impression of fruit is quite sweet. It's not actually sweet. It has no residual sugar, but the impression of its fruit is quite sweet. However, remember that trick I told you? Do the hold your nose test to see if it has any residual sugar, because your tongue will not lie. But you notice also, too, that in this wine, you get a slight eucalyptus note. This is quite common in Australian wines. Australia is home to more than 700 species of eucalyptus trees. As the wind blows through the trees, it picks up the oil from the leaves, which then lands on the grapes. For years, people debated whether eucalyptus trees in the area really did affect the grapes and the resulting wine. Gallo did a study in California to investigate this, and they made wines from specific vines at various distances from the eucalyptus trees. Do you know what they found? Yes, the wine made from the rows of vines closer to the eucalyptus trees had a more herbal, almost minty complexity. It's probably for the same reason that in the Rhone, you have the aromas of olives and rosemary. There are lots of herbs growing nearby. Now, in the Australian Shiraz, you may have noticed a very sweet vanilla and coconut flavor, which I talked about. But you may also get dill. Now, I don't get this particular aroma. I'm not sensitive to it. But you may be, and there are a lot of people who are. This vanilla, coconut, and dill character is associated with American oak, which we talked about in Lecture 16. We were talking about the differences between French and American oak. Look on the back label. For Australian brands, if it only says barrel maturation, it generally means American oak, because if they've coughed up the cash for the French barrels, they'd be the first to tell you. Now notice on the palate in between these two wines. Notice in the Rhone Syrah, the tannins are smaller and finer, but you may have more of them. In this one, I didn't, but you may have one that has much more of them. So they feel different. Notice in the Australian Shiraz that has American oak in it, the tannins feel bigger. We talked about the larger size marbles as an analogy. Now press your tongue up on your palate and really move your tongue in a way that you're really feeling the size of those tannins. But you also notice a warmth on the back palate. Shiraz has a higher level of alcohol than Rhone-style Syrah. And this is the difference between Syrah style and Shiraz style. I hope you were able to see, sniff, and taste the difference. If not, don't worry about it. You'll get there. I mean, I couldn't tell the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Cabernet Sauvignon when I first started. And speaking of barrels, in Lecture 19, we mentioned that barrels can be quite expensive. Not surprisingly, some modestly priced producers want the impression of oak flavor for their wines, but without the cost. So they use oak alternatives, such as oak chips or oak barrel staves. The producer places the chips or staves in the fermenting or maturing wine to get some oak flavor. It's much more economical. While you do get some oak flavor, the flavor is less well integrated and the tannins feel coarser for red wines, and you may feel dryness for whites as well. But that's how you're going to get some oak flavor and complexity at a lower price point. Producers throughout the world use these techniques, so it's not just Australia. But how can you tell if oak alternatives are being used? Look at the back label again. If it says oak influence or influence of oak or oak maturation without actually saying the word barrel or the word barriques, this would be a clue that an oak alternative may have been used. Now back to our South Australian regions. Barossa Valley is next to Eden Valley, and it's another region you should know. It's famous for its Shiraz, but it produces far more Riesling than the Eden and Clare Valley combined, and makes more Semillon than the lower or upper Hunter Valley. Some experts have pointed out that Barossa's total effective temperature for ripening is identical to Bordeaux. But in Barossa, there is more sunshine, lower humidity, and less rainfall, as well as much a wider diurnal temperature variation. These conditions make for very powerful reds and more voluptuous whites. The Shiraz that comes from Barossa is very deep, concentrated, and rich in raspberry fruit, with a chocolatey texture and velvety tannins and just that hint of eucalyptus as we saw here. These are much more robust than the Shiraz from the Hunter Valley, which is a bit higher in acidity than Barossa. Barossa has also received a lot of attention because it's home to what many consider Australia's first growth wine, Penfolds Grange, or you may say Grange. In 1951, Max Schubert created an experimental Shiraz bottling after fermenting an American oak, and he called it Grange Hermitage. In 1956, he unveiled this new wine to the Sydney trade, and the results were disastrous. So management told him to stop production, so he made it in secret. In 1962, Penfolds entered Grange Hermitage in competitions, and in the years since, it's won 50 gold medals. You see it today with just the word Grange as they dropped the name Hermitage from the label in 1988. Today, I've seen bottles priced at $300, and I've seen a 1976 for over $1,000 a bottle. As I make this course, there's a Penfolds Grange selling for $40,000. Another style of wine from this area is a blend of Grenache, Shiraz, and Mourvèdre, affectionately referred to in the industry as GSM. In Barossa, there are ungrafted Grenache vines up to 150 years old, which makes it a heritage area. These wines are rich and concentrated. However, the profile is quite different, with Grenache being the predominant grape variety. It will have more red fruit, more cherry fruit, a lower level of acidity, and a higher level of alcohol. Remember, Grenache loves the sun? For a good Shiraz, look south to the coastal region of McLaren Vale. Because of the proximity to the water, wine from this region will have a little less body than a similar wine from Barossa. Still farther south is the Limestone Coast, so named because of its soil. There are 6 regions within the Limestone Coast zone, but you may see on the label Limestone Coast, which means that the grapes could come from anywhere in that entire region. Now, the region of Coonawara, which we mentioned in Lecture 3, which has that beautiful terra rossa soil, that bright red clay loam, is over limestone. The climate in Coonawara is a bit cooler than Barossa, so Cabernet Sauvignon does very well. Here we have a Coonawara Cabernet Sauvignon. Let's take a look at the color. As we might expect, Cabernet Sauvignon, it's a deep ruby, and this one's slightly opaque. It's moderately intense in its aromatics. Definitely get that black currant and cassis notes, some dark fruit, some plum, getting a little bit of cherry notes. But I also get some of the herbaceousness, the green bell pepper, but it's not as strong as, let's say, Chile. But I do get the mint and eucalyptus here. Let's taste it. It's full-bodied, very, very concentrated, very rich. The tannins are dense and they're slightly gripping, but it also has a really nice level of acidity. I'd like to think that comes from the limestone soil and the terra rossa soil. Now for the last state. We go to Western Australia on the west coast. Here there is a range of climates from the very hot Swan Valley to the cool Margaret River, which exports a lot of wine to the United States. The Margaret River has a stronger maritime influence than any other region in Australia. Because of this climate, their Shiraz is not as hedonistic as Barossa. I've mentioned hedonistic, this term, before, and it refers to a wine that's quite round and big and voluptuous. Think of a Marilyn Monroe versus an Audrey Hepburn. That's what I mean by hedonistic. The aromas of the Margaret River Shiraz are slightly different than that of Barossa. My benchmark for Western Australian Shiraz is that it's a bit more black pepper in its aromas. The overall climate, however, is similar in temperature to Pomerol and Saint-Emilion in Bordeaux. The soil here is pretty gravelly, which is also reminiscent of Bordeaux, although the base is granite soil and not limestone. Therefore, it's no surprise that this region is also known for high-quality Cabernet Sauvignon. Next up, we go to New Zealand and South Africa. These countries are home to New World classics, and we have some new grape varieties here to unveil as well. You're going to need the following wines: a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, a Sancerre from France, a New Zealand Pinot Noir, a South African Steen, also called Chenin Blanc, a South African Pinotage, and a South African Cabernet Sauvignon, preferably from Stellenbosch. Until next time, I have a trivia question for you. Which wine-producing country closes more than 85% of its wines with screw caps instead of cork? Think you know the answer? Well, you'll have to find out in our next lecture. Until then, cheers.